Dave, I know I've been spending a lot of time complaining about driving, and I as often happens, I have to say that right now I'm in a place where I would gladly share a highway with a fleet of Subaru drivers, because in the last couple of weeks, my wife has needed the car for work, so I've been taking public transportation to the studio.
Oh, good man, good man. I'm sensing a story, Bradley. I'm sensing a story.
As so often happens, life handed me a little comeuppance from my Subaru speech a little while ago, and I was taking I take a bus and an elevated train out to the studio. So I went out this past week, and I went, as always happens, got right up to the bus stop just as the bus was pulling away, and waited for another 15 minutes for the next bus to come. The next bus comes, and it's crammed. And of course, I've got my shoulder bag, I've got a bag full of waters and stuff to take up to the studio. I'm all laden down with stuff. And it's standing room only in the bus, and a whole bunch of kids going to school. Right. So
you're getting spit wads thrown at you. You're like, look at the old man. You know, that kind of thing.
They're full of rambunctious energy, as well they should be. And of course, finally they get off the bus. I get up to the stop where I can get off and get on to the elevated train. Yep. I go up 3 sets of stairs to get all the way up, then across the overpass, come back down just in time to see the train pulling away.
Oh, no.
Now I'm waiting, and the next train is delayed 20 minutes because there's a mechanical problem. But
that sounds
fine.
like Philadelphia. Okay, keep going.
I can handle that. The next train finally comes. I get onto that one. Luckily, that one wasn't standing room only. I was able to sit down, and I go the several stops out to the Church Street station. I come down just in time for it's just a nice Philadelphia rain, David. It wasn't too bad walking the 5 or 6 blocks to my studio, because it was only raining cats and dogs, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been.
Just enough to get my socks soaked. That's enough.
Yeah, just enough to drown the local frogs hopping through the streets.
Sure.
And I got to the studio, walked up to the front door, and realized that I didn't have my keys.
No.
Because my habit is, when I grab my car keys, of course, I've got my studio keys. So since I didn't have my car keys, I didn't have my studio keys. So it took me an hour to get out to the studio, and an hour to come all the way back, only to walk in and just like, okay, I've wasted 2 hours of my day. I guess I'm working from home today.
That's one of those mornings where you sit very still at the kitchen table, just your hands flat on the table, like, well, I've made some choices. And you're just, no one else is home. The entire house is quiet. Your hands are palmed down on the table in front of you, like some psycho. And you're like, well, I'll just sit here for 3 hours very still.
You just
oh my God, you got all the way out there, didn't have your keys. Brad.
I didn't realize until I walked up to the door and put my hand in my pocket to get my keys, and there was nothing there.
With all the love in my heart, I wish I could just have peeked, just a peek into the self-dialogue as you patted every pocket on your body, and then patted every pocket on the backpack and the water bag. Like, to just get a glimpse of that self-talk of, was the phrase "son of a bitch" used, Brad? Can one guess what might have been used to describe oneself?
I can say this: if you've ever been to a large metropolitan city and you see somebody walking along the corner of the road and they're talking to themselves, I guarantee that person was me that day.
And on that note, I'm going to say hello, everybody, and welcome to ComicLab, the show about remembering your keys and making comics.
And the show about making a spare set of keys to go along with your SEPTA pass, and which I did this weekend, and making a living from comics. I'm Brad Guigar, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his friend Dave Kellett, who has known about the idea of a second set of keys for probably 30, 40 years now. Should have told my friend Brad. Maybe he didn't realize you could, for a mere pittance, couple of bucks, make a spare key. They're kind of on every street corner in a major city. I'm also the cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of the comic strip documentary Stripped.
And this week's hour of comics and key advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/ComicLab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. We've got a really good show for today. Really exciting set of topics. I'm excited for this. Brad gave me the rundown on the questions, and I'm excited to go through these today with everybody. But just a reminder that you could be watching the show right now live with all of our Patreon pals and friends over at the Live Gab level. That's at patreon.com/ComicLab. And the Live Gab level will give you the live stream of the show every week, which is archived in case you miss it. And it is super fun. We have a live chat going concurrently with the show, and we talk before, during, and after the show with folks, and it's a fun way to experience the show.
And Dave, I got to tell you this. I just got done telling you about how I took public transportation out to the studio and a bus and the train. I missed the train and all this other stuff. I came back and worked from the house, and you were saying, you know, that we were talking about how upset, right? Just tears streaming down his face. He worked from the house, by the way. I got to tell you, there were not tears streaming down my face. I had a couple seconds where I was kind of angry, but you know what? I had that Wacom One sitting there at home, and I knew that when I went home, I was going to grab that Wacom One. I wasn't going to suffer professionalism working from home. I got the Wacom One. I wasn't going to suffer power working from home. I got the Wacom One. I sacrificed clean socks with all the walking around in the rain I did, but that was on me. That Wacom One let me do the work from home, and I was just as happy as I could be once I stopped grinding my teeth.
I'll tell you what else was professional was that transition, because that gives me a chance to thank our sponsors for this week, the good folks at Wacom at Wacom.com, Wacom.com, the makers of the Wacom One, which is the kind sponsor of this and every week of ComicLab, which both Brad and I use in the studio, and which Brad uses as a backup when Brad forgets that a second set of keys can exist. I don't want to say Brad's age at this point, but just a reminder, Brad, that you can also have some phone numbers stored on your phone in case you need to contact anybody in emergencies. Just some basic life tips. A couple set of Band-Aids maybe in a drawer might be a good idea in case you ever scratch yourself. So anyway, we'll go through some life tips throughout the show for Brad. Just some reminders of how to live.
Just how to live tips.
Just a basic, recap on what it means to be a human in the world, Brad. Anyway, keys are a possibility. A second set of keys for Brad Geiger. Just a fun little pro tip. All right, so anyway, Brad, let's jump in. I got a question for you, Brad, that's coming in from Adam over at patreon.com/ComicLab. And Adam writes, to our dear comics uncles, Brad. To our dear comics uncles, comics creation is a game of visual and narrative problem solving, which is true. However, we also apply our personal taste to our work. I suspect that many new creators naturally focus on the latter, the exploration of our taste, oftentimes to the detriment of clear storytelling. With that in mind, are there 1 to 2 heuristics that beginning creators can keep in mind to avoid sacrificing clarity for artistic whimsy, both on the narrative and the visual side? All right, Brad. So first of all, heuristics. I got to tell you, Brad, that we don't often get asked a question with the word heuristic thrown in. And I got to tell you, if you're going to hand a clown a cream pie, you are going to get that cream pie back in the face, Brad. Heuristic.
Heuristics.
I have 2 master's degrees, and I kind of don't remember what heuristics means. It's something about learning, or like the strategy of learning, I think.
It's like every time as a person that teaches college, every time I use the word rubric, that's another word like that.
Oh my God! You should be punched on the street if you use the word rubric.
Yeah, exactly. Thank goodness it's taken us how many years now to get a question with the word heuristics in it? Thank God we finally got somebody asking. I would say, why doesn't somebody ask us about heuristics? And here we are talking about heuristics.
Well, please tell me, Brad. Please tell me that you have dictionary.com open and you have gone to heuristics for us.
I do.
Oh, I was joking, but you actually did. That's great.
Examinings, interrogatives, questions, analytical thought. That's what we're searching and Socratic examination.
Okay. So when Adam says, with that in mind, are there 1 to 2 heuristics that beginning creators can keep in mind? So I guess it's patterns of thinkings. It's logic flows. Is that what heuristics are? Okay. Boy, I always love, since language is our playground, we relish, by the way, Adam, we're joking only half-heartedly at your expense, because we love the idea of learning a new word or two every day. So that's fantastic. So, all right, Brad, I like this idea, though, that both new and, I will be honest, established creators, that there is a consideration, let's put it that way, about how broad to make a joke, a storyline, a character arc, or how personal. Like, it's funny to Brad Guigar, or it has meaning for Brad Guigar. But how then do you translate that, Brad, to a broader message, a more well-understood message, a more well-recognized and self-identifying for your audience message? How do you do that, Brad? And how do you balance the two?
It's actually a great question, and I don't know 100% what the answer is. And I would hasten to add that it's probably going to be a little bit different from every person. But let's talk about this. Let's discuss this for a little bit, because what we're talking about here goes back to that mirror research, market research thing that I always talk about, right?
Yes,
where I say, trust your market research in business decisions. And I say mirror research is always very good for creative decisions. But here we get into a question of how much mirror research, because as artists and as writers, as creators, we're always encouraged to follow your personal vision, right? We're always told that. Follow you, and that's advice we often give. Follow your personal vision. How many times have we said, make the comic that you want to see in the world?
Exactly.
Do the comic the way you think it should be done. And by the way, that's all very good advice. But like all things, it has a limit. And that limit just might be, at some point, you've got to realize that your stuff isn't connecting with an audience. It isn't something that other people are able to access. They're not in on it. And a great example is a guy that did 4.5 years of a comic strip about a comic strip that has starred a gargoyle that people couldn't tell was a gargoyle. And
for listeners at home, Brad is referring to himself and his own body of work.
Yes, it was a comic strip about the whole idea was that it was about people working on a comic strip, but but instead of doing it the way you would work on a comic strip, it was shot like a TV show. That was my personal vision. That was the story I wanted to tell. I didn't have the chops to tell that story the way it needed to be visually presented. It was way too thick to expect. At that point, it was 4 panels a day on a daily update, and it was a storyline. Back then, you could do it. Today, it would be impossible to do a 4-panel at a time storyline. But everything about it was my personal vision that just wasn't connecting. Now, throw in, Dave, the fact that I was trying to learn how to write humor, right? Yeah. And there's another one where, again, we're so encouraged to say, if it's funny for you, that's all that matters. Well, no, that's not the case. It's got to be funny to somebody else, except aren't we? Have you ever been in that situation, Dave, where, and maybe you've even said it. I know I've said it at least 1 or 2 times, where and maybe it was, my nose was bent out of joint, where I said, hey, I don't care if anybody else thinks it's funny. I think it's funny to me, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, well, it's funny because the longer I cartoon, the more I have fallen into that attitude of, I cartoon for me, but I share it with you, which is different than what I did when I started, which was I'm cartooning for you and I'm using my personal lived experience to write to that comic, Yeah. But it's funny how the more established I get, the more success I guess I get. That I now have the attitude of, no, I'm writing for me and I'm sharing it with you, which is a different and key turn in the way I phrase that. And but this is actually a far more complicated question than I thought it was at first glance, really, because the more I think about this, so, okay, I am absolutely 100% writing for me, but me, the idea of me is aware that I am writing for a commercial space and I'm writing for an audience. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm writing for me, for Dave, and yet Dave, quote unquote, is aware of the fact that he's writing for an audience.
Very much aware.
It's this multi-stage process where it is both commercial and creative that are feeding back on each other. And yet I try to write for me, and yet me is aware that I need to tone down the personality to make it broader at points, or to clarify my writing, or to be less specific to my own experience and to share it with a broader touchstone that other people can relate to, you know?
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is there's two stages of me, the me that's writing for me, and then the filter that goes, okay, this is for me, it's writing for me, but why don't we just change these couple words here so that it's a little bit more of a broader reach? Why don't we make the specificity here? Why don't we take that out and make it a little bit more, more of a shared experience for all of humanity? Okay, great. How about you, Brad? How do you approach it now?
Well, listen, I think that we talked about this on the show a couple of weeks ago, where I said comics has always been a commodity, right? We talk about the art of comics and all this other stuff, and that's great, but comics has always been a commodity. It's always been built to sell to someone, right? That's the very heart of what comics is, and we can't take that part of it out of the process. It's always got to be sellable at some point. Otherwise, I mean, yes, you can look at it as an art piece, but then you also take the concept of audience and you have to reframe that as well. Okay, so you can have that attitude, but you just have to take the consequences that come along with it. What does all that mean? I think what it means is that I think Dave and I would both say all of that advice that we give week after week on the show, be true to your own personal vision. Yes, that's absolutely right. Write the comic that you want to read. Yes, absolutely. But at some point, you do have to take an objective look at what that is, how it's connecting with the audience. And there may come a time when you have to take a realistic look at what you're doing and still tell the comic that you want to share with the world, but you might have to change how you're delivering it a little bit, how you're delivering that story. And that could take one of many, many different ways. That could be the writing, that could be the publishing, that could be the format, that could be where you decide, how you decide to present it. It could be a wide range of things. But it just might mean at some point you're still telling the story true to your vision, but you might have to make a little bit of adjustment in there as to how you're doing that. And like I said, it could take a number of different forms to make sure that you are connecting with an audience, because as important as it is for you to tell your true vision, and it is important, it's also important for you to be able to connect with an audience. And you've got to be able to bridge that gap and make the rest of that equation happen.
Let's make this really personal. Because art making, art sharing is communication. And at its most basic level, anyone, no matter what type of relationship you are in, whether it's a professional, whether it's friendship, whether it's romantic, if you are at all good at communicating with your fellow human beings, you know that you amend the way that you are going to say a thing. You revise it ever so slightly from how you truly feel about Brad and wanting to tell Brad. And instead you say, Brad, when you do this, you make me feel, right? You change the way your language to be far more passive and warmly welcoming, so that Brad can come to a moment of change rather than saying, Brad, you son of a bitch, you got to do the dishes. I say, Brad, when you don't do the dishes, you make me feel unloved, right? We say phrases like that, and good, not that, but you get what I'm saying, is that I amend what the core message is still the same, but if I'm at all artful in how I navigate my life, I amend the way I say to Brad, hey, I need you to change or do this way. And that's professional environments, we do that. Instead of saying like, hey, you didn't answer my questions, you say, swinging back around, I just wanted to get more clarity on the previous email, right? Like that kind of thing. You change your language so that you can better interact with people. And the same is true with art. So what Brad and I think we're both arguing is that, yes, absolutely, write for your core self, write for your enjoyment, write for the art that you want to see in the world. But with the awareness that you're not living in a bubble, yes, of course, slightly amend the way you present that to the world so that you can reach a broader audience, or better teach, or better edify, or however you want to say it, with your art, so that it has a better impact.
Now, as far as heuristics go, if I were to offer,
ding, 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 ding. That's our word of the day, heuristics.
If I were to offer a rubric for going about this, the answer to the question is that this is not math. This is not quantifiable. I wish I could tell you. I wish I could tell you. And this is a story as old as comics itself. From the very beginning of Webcomics Weekly, what was the question we got? How many page views do I need before I'm successful? People wanted a number, right? How many unique visitors a month do I have before I launch a t-shirt? We're always looking for numbers. We're always looking for something quantifiable. And the sad and truthful matter of the situation is this: there are none. This is art that we're talking about. This is communication.
Yes.
This is something that you have to take on a feel basis. And it's something that you've also got to be. And this is the hardest part. You got to be honest with yourself, because since there are no numbers, since I can't tell you that there's a number you've got to hit and then you're successful, since I can't give you that, you've got to take it as an objective look at yourself. And so many times we're very, very forgiving of our own faults, if not blind to our own faults. Otherwise, I couldn't have spent 4.5 years on a comic that was not connecting.
Yeah.
I couldn't have. I was not being honest with myself for a long, long time. It took me that convention appearance in Toronto that I've told you about in the past, where literally I spent 3 days with nobody stopping by my table before I realized, hey, I don't think this is working out the way it's supposed to. You've got to come to that on your own. I can't give you a heuristic. The heuristic doesn't exist.
Stop saying heuristic. Now you're just rubbing it in that you have the dictionary in front of you.
I can't give you a strategy. The strategy doesn't exist. What you've got to do is get a feel for how your work is connecting with people. And that's on any number of things. The responses you're getting on social media. Are you getting emails? Are you gaining traffic on your website? Are you getting more followers? Stuff like that. Did you do a Kickstarter? Did it go over? Did it not go over? Like I always tell you, Kickstarter is free market research. That's another one, right? Yeah. You've got to take all of those. And the most important thing you've got to take is time. You've got to take your time. See how this lands with people. See how it lands with people over time. There's no quick fix. There's no shortcut. There's no making your first post and it has the maximized amount of followers. There's none of that. This stuff takes time.
Yeah, I still have a lot of thoughts on this, and I want to keep sharing more about this. So, to the people out there listening going, no, I don't need to make market considerations, or I don't need to make artist considerations. I write for me. I get that. Brad gets that. We understand that. With Drive, I largely do operate from that standpoint and then adjust it at the last minute in terms of script for an audience. But I understand and get writing for yourself. And I want to say, for those people, you can take the path of writing just for yourself, right? Emily Dickinson she shared it with maybe 1-2 people her whole life. Leaves of Grass. I don't know that more than 2 people saw Leaves of Grass before Walt Whitman died, if I remember correctly. Bill Watterson's current paintings. He's got enough money now where he can just not have to share it with anybody. Yes, you can live a life where you create your art for you. And absolutely that has value. It builds a better life for you. Brad and I are just saying that once you accept that you want to have your art get out into the world and impact other people, that is when you have to start adjusting your footfalls in terms of how do I say this? Is there a better way to approach this so that a broader number of people can understand or get what I'm trying to say here? That it's not just for you. So yes, you can create just for you, and that's it. But the odds are that relatives are going to find your poetry after you die and go, yikes, I'm glad they never shared this. More likely than they go, wow, we've got to publish this. Emily Dickinson was really good. There's 10,000 bad versions versus the one Emily Dickinson is what I'm getting at there, right? Because something about the consideration of other people reading your work modifies and in some ways improves your writing towards the universality of human existence, right? It's less personalized and less specific to, well, I didn't know that person in high school, so I don't get that joke, or I never went to this geographic location, so I don't get that joke. So you broaden it out and you make it more universal, and in so doing, it becomes actually better art in many respects, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thought. The other thought is it's interesting when someone who has established a level of success says, shine my audience, I'm writing more specific to me. And I have two really interesting and very different examples of artists that did that. They had a generally accepted talent with a language that was modified for their audience. And then they went, nope, I'm writing more specific to me. The first one is BC, and we've made this joke before. The comic strip BC.
Yeah.
I think once he had a moment of sort of personal revelation and got very religious in his life, there was a lot of Jesus jokes in BC, a comic we've talked about that was before Christ. It makes no sense.
It's right there in the title.
It makes no sense. What I'm getting at is that's such a specific personal writing into a comic strip for which it was not constructed or built to do that, right?
Yeah, I think the one heuristic that we can give is balance. I think it all comes down to balance. I think yes, you have to tell your story, tell the story that you want to make the comic that you want to make. Yes to all of those things. But you also have to balance that with a certain amount of market research, where you say, is this connecting? Am I telling a story that people want to read? Am I telling it in a way that they want to read it? All of those things. I think it comes down to balance. I think this is one of those issues that you really have to find where that lands in the middle for you. And that means probably doing it wrong for a little bit of time.
Yeah,
right?
Probably does.
Erring a little bit too mirror, sometimes error a little bit too market, because let's face it, in the same way that we've just had a lot of examples of people relying on their mirror too much, we can also, we can come up with a number of these people that relied too much on the market without enough of the mirror. Right.
Yeah.
And that comes. And by the way,
because then you get too generalized to the point of bland or unnecessary, you know, like
and spiritless. Speaking of mistakes that I've made, I'll give you another one from my personal history. This was in the early days back in the 90s. Greystone Inn I started out with Greystone maybe a couple of years. And newspapers were still a thing. And I was still considering newspaper syndication because newspapers hadn't faced the big decline yet. You could see it on the horizon, but they hadn't faced the big decline. And I was preparing, I don't know that I've ever told you this, Dave. I prepared a newspaper syndicate submission that was going to be a spinoff of Greystone Inn, and I had read one of these stories about the boomeranger generation. Do you remember this? The boomeranger. These were kids that went off to college, got their degree, and then they boomeranged back and lived with mom and dad.
Sure.
Which is actually more and more common now. It's not so much of a thing. Just
because we've built a society where kids don't get paid enough with their first post-college job. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because of economics.
Yeah, exactly.
But back in the 90s, this was a new concept. This was just starting to happen. They called it the boomerang generation. And so I came up with a comic idea based on people that I had already developed in my comic, Greystone Inn, and I developed a syndicate pitch for basically this very syndicate. In fact, I might have even called it, boomerangers or whatever. It was about this young guy that comes back to live with mom and dad. It wasn't my experience. It wasn't like my kids were toddlers at this point. I didn't do it. My kids were years from the possibility of doing it. I had no personal passion. I had literally built this on a newspaper article about demographics. And I said to myself, there's a demographic, and newspaper editors are always looking for demographics. I could lock this demographic up. The problem was I didn't give two shits about the story I was writing. I didn't care about the jokes. I didn't care about the characters. I cared about hitting a demographic. In other words, where we've been talking all this time about hitting your mirror too hard and telling the story that you want to tell.
Right.
I hit the market too hard, and I didn't care about the story. I just cared about the economics. I just cared about the audience side. I didn't have, and by the way, I wrote a bunch of crap. It was horrible. It didn't work because I had the balance all on the other side too. So this is one of those cases where I'm going to say, and it's very specific. We're talking about ideation and creation of art. This is a very specific case where I'm going to say you want to try to find a balance of the mirror and the market, because and just like I did, you might have to spend a few years doing it wrong on either side of the scale.
Yeah. And lest you think that Brad and I have that figured out, it is still a dance that we have to do on a day-to-day basis and occasionally get wrong. Like sometimes I will do a comic and I can tell people are like, what? This is Dave, are you trying to communicate something, Dave? Is something wrong at home? Like clearly I got way too specific. Like maybe no one else has that problem with butter knives or whatever the joke is that I've made, And so, so yes, it can swing both ways. And yes, it's still a problem that we have after 20, 25 years of cartooning. Yeah. But it's like, as Brad made an earlier point, and I want to just reiterate this, it's not engineering. It's not like we can plug in the numbers and say, oh, well, the load-bearing beam of a 25-inch maple beam can hold, so much, and then how far you can build. I mean, it's a lot of it is by feel and by trial and error. And so the method that I would use to describe for a new cartoonist or a young cartoonist is first draw from your heart, right? Yep. If you're going to err on the side of one way or the other, right? If you have to choose market versus mirror, choose mirror. Right for you, because you're in a learning process. Your audience is not that big anyway. Yep. And if you write for you with a passion that triggers you, you're going to keep cartooning. You'll do tomorrow's if you enjoyed the process of today's. So write for you and keep an eye as you go on how you can make gentle modifications to what is a very specific choice, so you can more generalize that thought, that communication out to a broader audience, right? Let your filters start to impact your work slowly and see how you do.
And I'm going to add one more heuristic to that, and it's this. Every chance you get, become a member of your audience. And there's one way that you can do that, and that is to read old stuff that you wrote.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And I'm a big proponent of this. You've heard me say it on the show many, many times, but because what happens is like that butter knife joke that you wrote, Dave, right? And you were like in a very specific place. Yes. Well, at some point, you're going to be in a different headspace. So if you wait enough time and you let enough time go by, you can actually join the audience because you'll be in a different headspace. Yeah. You'll be in a neutral headspace, and you will have forgotten what you wrote about. Right? You got to let a few weeks, maybe some months go by to really read that clean with a fresh set of eyes.
Yes.
You've completely forgotten what you wrote and how you wrote it. And that's the only way that you can really see your mistakes is to have some really old stuff that you're reading again from the first time.
Right. Because then with the passage of time, the subjective falls away, and then you're looking at it with objective eyes. And that's when it really becomes clear. Oh, I wrote this too specific. Oh, I wrote this too generalized, and it was spiritless. So you can see one way or the other as to how it fell down. So anyway, Adam, I thank you for this question, because my God, this turned out to be a really long and interesting conversation about this. And I actually have more we could say, but I want to say more than anything else, Adam, thank you for giving Brad the new toy of the word heuristic, because I noticed Brad dropping that in every second sentence. That one, oh God, we're going to get off this podcast and get on the phone later on. He's be like, well, all right, I'm off to do my heuristics for the day. I'm like, God damn it, Brad. You can't use it with every sentence. Oh, geez.
But I can try.
Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we've recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. no worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics.
So, Dave, I wanted to start the second half of the show with a little update. We were talking about Kickstarter's problems with their blockchain announcement. Our update is a short while ago that Kickstarter CEO Aziz Hassan was stepping down. He's not going to be the CEO of Kickstarter any longer. Instead, the COO, Sean Lau, Leow, will be the interim CEO, and that a search for a permanent replacement is already underway.
This is interesting in light of the whole discussion and kerfuffle around using blockchain and perhaps using crypto on Kickstarter. So we'll see where that goes. They, as far as I could read on that media release, they had said that they were still committed to that path.
Yeah.
Although it sounds to me like this was highly related, this stepping down, didn't it to you? The timing was very suspicious.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that was, I don't know that you can separate those two things. It seems pretty relevant. And I mean, the whole thing is that they're still going to kind of go down that path, but they're keeping it separate. They're being very careful about how they're doing it, but they're still going to be pursuing this as far as my understanding of what's going on. But it definitely had ramifications for the CEO. The thing that this raised a question for me is, do you notice we haven't heard anything more about Gumroad, which was a similar situation, right? In fact, they took a much more antagonistic response to people pushing back on blockchain, and nothing's I haven't heard anything new on that front.
Well, my spidey senses tell me that a press professional was brought in, and the old rule of press relations 101 is stop digging, which is why we sort of have radio silence. If you're creating a problem, at least stop digging. And I think that's what happened with Gumroad, is that they just said, go quiet for a while, let 3, 6, 9 months go by, and then you can start talking about things again. But yeah, you're right. And then the other update we have, and this is our famous mid-show update where we correct, amend, or revise things that were said a mere 10 minutes ago earlier in the show.
One of those.
One of those, yes. And so as we've already learned from the show, and this is involving no one reading from a dictionary online, that heuristics are mental shortcuts that can facilitate problem solving and probability judgments. Since we already knew that already off the cuff and didn't need to read that as a definition, I should mention that during the break, Brad advised me that he has now connected his spare key to his public transportation card. Yeah. So look at Brad using heuristics over here like a college professor.
I got my own heuristics. That's right.
He's got his own problem solving and his own way of figuring out a solution and probability judgments that he will now have his key with him. So good job, Brad, on your heuristics.
I loved when Annie Lennox used to sing with the heuristics. They were a really great 80s pop. I loved them.
I got to tell you, though, I went to my ophthalmologist, and he said that was my big problem, was my heuristics. So
you had heuristics problems? Yeah. They give you eye drops for that now.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a whole thing. I had to get glasses. Well, Brad, let me jump us into our next question coming in from patreon.com/ComicLab from Tikaka. And they write, "Hi, Comics Uncles. I'd like to ask you about line weight. I've used felt tip pens, dip pens, brush pens, fountain pens, and digital. That's pretty much the full gamut. And I'm still searching for the perfect line weight variety. My lines have fluctuated between boringly flat, same thickness, to the line weight varying so much that the drawings become illegible." Well, that's an interesting way to describe that. "You both have really good, engaging line art that is still clear to read. How do you decide where to lay the thicker lines and how much to vary? What tools do you use? Do you switch tools between lines or use just one? Does your digital art rely as much on swish, Control-Z, whoosh as mine does?" And for those that don't know, that's the sort of thing where you make one line, you hit Control-Z, you make the same line again, hit Control-Z. Yeah. Third time's a charm, that one works, you move on to the next line. Yeah. So share your secrets, Tikaka says. "Thanks for the great show. It's a joy every time." Brad, this is a fun question. I do love an art question on the show. So how do you best describe how you have found your line weight that is perfect, or have you yet found your perfect line weight?
Oh, Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I'll know in a few years if I found my perfect line weight. But until then, I can tell you this. I think that line weight, as far as doing, black and white line art previous to being colored. In other words, most of the kind of art that you look at in comics, I think line weight is one of the most crucial areas to really make your art sparkle and make your art communicate. And this whole idea of having lines that vary so much that it's illegible, I totally get that.
Yeah.
The bigger problem you see in a lot of Pro-Am comics is just the opposite. They have no variance in the line. All the lines are pretty much the same width, and it gives you that effect of what I call a coloring book art. Right. It's
Yes.
art that looks like it's built for a coloring book. It's got those big, thick lines. I want to encourage you to take a fresh look at your art sometime this week and look at whether your lines have enough variance. There's two areas that I really try to concentrate on line art in terms of the different weight. And that is, for starters, that's going to be light and shadow. I'm going to try to indicate a little bit of shadow in certain places by a heavier line.
Yes.
And opposite those areas, obviously, those lines are going to be lighter where the light's hitting. I like to indicate light and shadow with my line.
And just as a real clear description of that, if you're drawing a ball, a sphere, the side of the sphere closer to the sun would be a very thin line. The side of the sphere farthest from the sun would be a very heavy side of the ball. So it'd be a thick line on the one side, a thin side on the other. Sorry, keep going, Brad.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really quick way to kind of level your art up very quickly, is just to kind of think about light and shadow when you're drawing that line. And then another thing is a difference between an outline and a detail line. This is one that's really super important. The outline line has to be somewhat heavier than the detail line. The line that describes the shape all the way around the character has to be a little bit heavier. And then the lines that might indicate the mouth, the eyes, the wrinkles around the eyes.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes.
The laugh lines, so on and so forth. Those detail lines have to be much, much finer, much thinner, still strong enough to hold up. But they've got to be noticeably different than the outline lines, because if those two lines are too similar, it flattens your art out immediately. It's just no matter how good the coloring is, your art is flat if there's not a variance between the outer line that describes the big shapes and the little lines that define the fine details.
That's right. So the question now is, how do you get this? And there's a couple different strategies you can use. One is the Bill Watterson method. You can get a Winsor Newton 7 sable. It's no longer sable, obviously, because those are real bad for sables. But you can get a Winsor Newton faux sable, like a 7, and or perhaps like a Charles Schultz quill, right? And a quill point. And that kind of physical medium will give you a variance that you cannot recreate with a mechanical or a nib type ink pen. It just can't do it. And so you'll see immediately with a Winsor Newton 7. My line with the merest 1 billionth of an ounce more pressure, I get an infinitely darker line, right? And so your line becomes more alive with a Winsor Newton or with a quill pen. Here's the problem: it's hard to reproduce the exact look that you want without practice. It's going to take you years. That's step number one, right? The other one is to do that digitally, because you can obviously control it a little bit more, and you can go from you can have a same kind of a brush tip pen digitally that you can control. So if a 30 tip is not working for you, you try 25. 25 is still too big. You go down to 20, and you can vary it up and down, depending on how much control you need, right?
Yep.
So that's another one. Another technique that you can do is the Al Hirschfeld technique, which is you build a line using thousands of little lines.
Yeah.
And that's where
if you have one.
Yeah, I use this one myself, where if you draw, as I do with Sheldon, where it's analog, it's ink on paper.
Yeah.
I use a Micron Pigma pen. But if you ever watch one of my live streams or see a video, there's probably one of me drawing somewhere online. You can see that I create a line using 10 lines to create that curve. And then I'll turn the paper or switch my wrist and go, and there's the next 10 lines, right? Whereas you watch Watterson draw and he, one dip of the brush and it's whoop, 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 whoop.
Yep,
and all of Calvin's done, And so it's very different ways to build a line. Both of us, though, both Brad and I would say that you want to avoid that coloring book look because it has a lifelessness to it. I would rather have you be a few years of being, as you say, illegible, but working towards a more interesting and varied line art than staying and leaning towards the cartoon book look, the coloring book look.
Yeah. And meanwhile, if you're working digitally, one trick that you can have is to adjust the pressure sensitivity of your drawing instrument, right? You can make it more sensitive. If you're having trouble getting the line to be varied, you can make it more sensitive. So it's going to pick up greater differences between your hand pressure and that's going to affect your line. Right. Or if you're having problems on the other side and, you can also decrease the sensitivity. If you're having too much variance, you can decrease the sensitivity a little bit and rein that in somewhat so that your lines don't get out of control.
And I will. Can I jump in on that,
ahead.
Brad? Because I just did this yesterday, actually.
Yeah.
When I want to say that adjusting the digital controls of your sensitivity is a little bit sometimes like the controls on your shower, where you have a 180-degree potential turn, right, of how far you could turn the knob, but really only 1 to 2 degrees are radically important to you, and everything else is, like you turn 1/8 of an inch on a shower controller, and suddenly you're in hell, and you turn the other way, and suddenly you're in Antarctica. And so the same sometimes is true with sensitivity because we're all so specific in our drawing that you change the sensitivity settings one iota and you'll notice a difference. I promise you, if you get in the right range, you'll notice a difference. So that's a great tip from Brad.
Yeah, you don't have to change it much. And do your here's my experience. I changed the pressure sensitivity. I put my stylus to the tablet and immediately I'm like, oh, this is horrible. And I change it right back. And give yourself a little bit of time to get used to the new sensitivity. And taking Dave's advice, just change it a little bit. And then take my advice and stick with it for a little while before you immediately recoil in horror and say, oh, this is horrible. This is terrible. But it is something I'm glad that that this is on your radar, because I really do think it's one of the most important things that doesn't get talked about nearly enough is good quality line art. And it's too bad because there's a lot of people doing some good work with some dead lines that just, and I know it's not making that visual impact that it could be making. And it's just, it breaks your heart. It's like, pay attention to your line.
Yeah. And I will say this is that it's be prepared that and you already know this because of the nature of your question, but be prepared that this is a process. When you're working analog, it's a years-long process to master a brush or master a quill, or even, frankly, master a mechanical type nib pen, because they all have their own quirks and idiosyncrasies. And it's not an overnight thing where you're like, now I'm good. And I've learned the brush, right? Yeah. And I would say that Photoshop in the last 2 or 3 years, their brush variability has gotten amazing because they hired and they brought in shop there. Oh, now I'm blanking on his name, but a genuine master of digital brushes. And so the archive library of brushes available to you now in the cloud of Photoshop is amazing. And really, you should spend a Saturday just doodling on, and Brad probably could say the same for CSP, but just doodling in Photoshop because there's so many brushes. And when you find the right one, it's revelatory. You're like, oh, this is the brush I've been looking for. And there, you'll start to spot what kind of designs as digital brushes. When you'll see them in the way they design, you're like, nope, I want more of a flare at the end. Or no, I need a heavier, chunkier line. This one's not for me. And so you'll get better within an hour. You'll say, oh, now I know what type of brush I'm looking for. And then your hunt will get more specific. But anyway, a Saturday of sketching with digital brushes from Photoshop is a great way to spend your day.
Yeah. That person whose name you were trying to think of, was it Friendon by any chance?
No, but it was the other brush designer. I think there's two that are very good.
That was my next suggestion. Do check out Friendon. And I think it's just Frenden.
Yeah, but Friendon makes beautiful brushes. Yes,
and they make brushes for Photoshop as well as Clip Studio. And those, if for my money, those are some of the best just meat and potatoes inking brushes and penciling brushes that you could possibly get for digital. I love my Friendon brushes. And they're very affordable. This is not a out of reach thing. You can very easily justify making that investment to get some good brushes. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is how working digitally has changed absolutely the way how I draw for the better. And that is the question asker asked about, drawing a line and then erasing it, drawing a line, undo, drawing a line, undo. I do that all the time. And in fact, not only do I draw a line maybe 3 times, undoing it every time until I get the right line, I don't think twice about it, because the important thing is getting that line right. I also draw as much with my eraser as I do with my pen. Have you found yourself doing this?
I do actually.
Like, I find I really am drawing with my eraser, or, getting a line shaped up, or just getting something pushed into where it needs to be. I'm drawing almost as much with my eraser as I am with my pen.
Yeah, and I will say this too. There's little tricks you can do too, where you need a big energy line, but you're introducing it onto an already complicated and overly drawn space. Yeah. So you can just create a new layer for that single line, right? That you need to be a high energy line, erase it down to where it needs to go, to Brad's point, and then flatten those 2 layers again if you want. Let digital process be your friend in terms of, if you need to do a high energy line that's a big swoop that would otherwise complicate and overdraw, you can make a new layer, do the big swoop, erase it down, bada bing, bada boom. Bob's your uncle, as they say in Britain, Brad.
That's right. But congratulations on being cognizant of line weight, because I really do think that it's one of the most important things in comic art that you could possibly do to make your work visually connect. So I'm glad you're thinking about it.
Yeah, and really the personal heuristics of brush maintenance and line work is going to be one of the more interesting journeys you have on your own
Absolutely.
comics.
So, Dave, I've got a question for you. This is a topic that I am bringing to the table because I found out through the ComicLab Discord server. This is still a thing. Do you remember those top website list sites? There used to be a few of them where basically
from the late 90s?
Yeah, where basically you would say to your readers on your website, when you read the comic, vote for it by clicking this button. It takes them over to that website. It registers a vote. And of course, the more votes you get, the higher your banner ad appears on this whole website that's nothing but banner ads for webcomics. And of course, the goal is to get higher and higher. And it was supposedly that's going to generate traffic by people clicking those banner ads and coming back to your site, discovering your work, as it were. And I just wanted to know from you, these have been around. These sites have been around for a long time. Did you ever participate in this? Is it something you would consider participating in today? What are your thoughts on the top webcomic list sites?
Well, I'm glad you asked me this, but can I take a small journey to tie in a separate topic that I'd like to introduce into the conversation? Sure. So for those that haven't yet done it, if you haven't yet taken out a paid ad in your local telephone book, this is a great time to find success in cartooning by taking out a television or a paid ad in your local phone book. Now, listen, the phone book is obviously it's big, it's heavy, it's chunky, but it's where you want to be. It's where business is found.
What you want to do, Dave, is let your fingers do the walking.
That's right, Brad. Let your fingers do the walking, to coin a phrase. Yes, Brad, exactly. So listen, people need a plumber. They know where to go. That phone book is right there.
That's
people
why
need
I
to
call
know,
my comic AAA Comics, because it's first on the list on the yellow pages.
Brad, you're so far ahead of me on all of these. Yes, and yes. Let your fingers do the walking. You're going to want to use a heavily A name at the front, maybe AAA plumbing, AAA veterinary services, whatever you can do. You know, it's a little seedier when you're a lawyer and you're like AAA law firm. That's kind of weird. But yes, all of that works. The phone book is where you want to be. And that's my advice for this week, Brad. How about you?
I'll tell you what, I am not a fan of these sites
I kind of didn't know that they were still around. I'm
neither
only
did
going
I.
to tell them myself.
And there are some people that really are kind of like, no, I still think that there's something there. You've got to make me believe before I would put any amount of time into this, the first thing I've got to believe, and I don't, by the way, I really don't believe this, but I would have to believe that there's a significant number of people that go to that website looking for webcomics to read. And then they're going, oh, here's one that's at the top. It must be very good. I'll click that one and read it. Or maybe they'll peruse down a little bit. You've got to make me believe that there's a significant number of actual webcomics readers, not other webcomics creators who are checking out the competition, but actual webcomics readers who are going to these sites looking for things. And we know from several years, from over a decade of social media dominated internet, we know that that's not how people go out and consume content anymore.
Or find content. Yeah.
In the early 2000s, people were foragers. They were foraging for things. And maybe this top webcomics list place had a place at that time. But today, people are getting a steady stream of too much content, more content that they could possibly consume. And it's coming through Twitter. It's coming through Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, you name it. Plus any of those comics that they discovered through those places that they might have, let's say, bookmarked or have different ways of following those updates, whether it's on Webtoons or on the person's own site. We know that people don't consume content that way anymore and haven't for decades, or at least a decade. You'd have to first make me believe. And the only way you could do it would be with a hammer. If you hit me hard enough in the forehead, you might make me believe that there are people going to those sites looking for things to read. Tell you what, to teach Brad something with a hammer, that's a hell of a heuristic approach. We're gonna hammer it home with Brad. I'm trying out these new heuristics with Brad. It's called a Black & Decker. That's what it is. Yeah, but let's say you bought in that far. Let's say that somebody used a hammer on you and you believe that this is happening. Let's take a look at how webcomics actually work today and what you're doing. So the whole thing you've got to do.
Yeah, this is what I was going to get into. I think you're about to walk down the path that I'm interested in. Yes, keep going. So
now you've got your comic, you're on the website, or you're doing this through social media, however it is you're doing this, and you're telling people on a daily basis, hey, don't forget, when you read my comic, vote for me on this top webcomic list. Vote for me. You've got a prominent vote button somewhere.
This is my problem with
on your site. Vote for me. Do this. And it's every day. It's every day. Vote for me. Vote for me. Vote for me. And then you even see, I don't know whether you're familiar with this, certain people, certain comics artists will even give them a voting incentive. If you click the vote button, you will unlock maybe a bonus panel or an exclusive comic or some kind of prize that you're getting incentivized for clicking that vote button. And then you go over and a vote is registered. And also, by the way, I don't know which site you're looking at, but I reviewed these not too long ago. There was a couple of them that I don't want to make any allegations, but let's put it this way. If I found out later on that they were gaming the system somehow, they were somehow gaming the votes. If I found out they were doing that, I wouldn't be surprised. You wouldn't knock me over with a feather, is I guess what I'm trying to say. If some of these votes were being gamed, you could just kind of tell with common sense and looking at them that somebody's playing the system. Now, this is the game that you're playing. see if this sounds familiar. You've got repeated outreach. You've got repeated contact with your reader. You've got incentives. You've got exclusives. You've got bonuses. For the love of Pete, you've got a Patreon campaign there that you ain't getting paid for. The whole thing is you've got a Patreon campaign to get on a banner that's being rigged, and you're getting nothing out of it.
I mean, this is where my frustration builds with this, is that when you have captured a reader, right? Like, you have a new reader, and you've done all the work to make them loyal. They're coming to your comic, or they're getting it by email, or they're doing whatever. They're enjoying your comic. It's working, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing: what you're getting with that reader is a certain amount of personal currency that you can spend.
Yes.
You can ask them to do X number of things, and if you're going to ask them to waste it on voting on a top webcomic, you're reducing the amount of currency that you can spend to ask them to back a Kickstarter, or ask them to get your new book, or ask them to go to Patreon and support you, or ask them to actually spread the word in a way that would be helpful.
Yes.
So you're spending down your currency with this reader, and I don't even know what you're gaining, because to Brad's point, who the hell is searching for new things to read off a website thing that was from 1999 that I didn't even know if it was that effective in 1999, to be honest, you know?
Yeah.
So these websites have like all the ranking interest that like a Webtoons has, without any of the benefits of being able to actually read the thing that Webtoons has, or in a clear format. It always looks like a web design from 10 years ago, for another thing. I haven't looked at them in a long time, but at least that's how they used to look. I just see that this is a waste of your currency that you have earned with the hard work and with good comics with your readers, that you're asking them to spend in the wrong way.
Right, because you've been after them day after day after day. Vote for me, vote for me, vote for me. When it comes time to say, "Hey, here's my Kickstarter. It's time for you to make a pledge." That reader is saying, "I've been voting for you every day for X number of months. Now I got to make a pledge too." You cannot be surprised that your crowdfunding outreach is negatively affected by the fact that you've been after this reader every day, day after day after day, telling them to vote. At some point, the reader says, "I've done enough. All I wanted to do was read a comic. I didn't want this much of a commitment. I got to click this. I got to do that. I got to go here. I got to go there." You've, like Dave said, it was the perfect way of saying it. You wasted your currency on crap that ain't going to develop into anything. You waste when you should have been building community, when you should have been making that into a crowdfunding direction. You wasted it on this thing that's giving you nothing. I cannot advise strongly against participating in this.
There's at least on my part, there was always the perception of an insularity in terms of the community of these places, which is like, it always felt like the only people that were going there or checking it or looking at it were the same 100 to 200 participants of the thing. You know what I mean?
Yes, everybody checking out the competition.
Similar, but not even in this regard, but similar to how the R Comics is on Reddit, which is like, that's different though, because there are people that genuinely enjoy comics, and you can actually read the comics on that subreddit, right? So you actually are getting good voted up entertainment on that. Whereas this is just the same 100, 200, 300 people all doing a dance. It's like, now I'm 48, now I'm 47. Hooray, now I'm 45. This is what a great week I'm having. You know, that kind of,
and it doesn't matter until you're number 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and you're never going to get there because those people have got that locked up.
And also, to the point, it's insular. Like, it feels like you're only being shown to the same 300 people who are also participating. Right. You know what I mean?
Right.
I don't know that this is outreach in the way that you want it to be outreach. To Brad's point, it's 10 years past where people out foraging for things to read in a way that these kind of sites tried to anticipate, but no longer. I mean, nobody's like, if I, Brad, suddenly am interested, I don't read mysteries, but if I suddenly wanted to read mysteries, am I looking up something like top mystery books that are self-voted by the art, like they're promoted by the author and their audience? It would just be weird. You wouldn't find it that way, you know, like that's not like, think it through. That's not how people find things.
Yeah, no, not only that, but like I said, I really do think not only is it kind of wasted space, I think it's an actual negative effect. I think it's a detriment on your audience building. I absolutely, I believe it's a detriment on your crowdfunding. if you're doing this.
Yeah,
Because
I'm sincere about currency. You have
Yeah.
a certain amount that you can, once you've built up the loyalty, the kindness, the thankfulness that you have entertained someone, right?
Yeah.
That's a certain currency that you can spend. And if you choose to spend it on this, it is frankly a waste of money. Like it's not what you want to get for all the work that you've put into that comic.
Oh, and I'll tell you another thing. I've used up all of my currency in another episode of the Comic Lab podcast because I got nothing else to give. It's time for me to say you've been listening to Comic Lab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Well, and as always, we thank you for tuning into our heuristic-based learning experience here. Your hosts have been my friend Brad Guigar, the head heuristic editor of webcomics.com and the heuristic creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And my friend Dave Kellett, who takes heuristics so personally that he only accepts organic heuristics because he's only into holistic heuristics. And he's the co-director of the comics documentary Stripped and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com.
I'm now thinking this is something I need to have my urologist check that my heuristics are wrong. The Comic Lab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net, and this episode was edited by Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love Comic Lab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a future episode.
And Comic Lab is made possible by your support on patreon.com/comiclab. So we'll go ahead and say that twice. Patreon.com/still don't know what heuristics means.
Oh, Dave, I found a book. You were talking about learning more about heuristics, and I did look this up on Amazon.com. It's a guide that's going to help you out. It's actually by Dr. Seuss. Horton, here's a heuristic.
It's just Horton wearing a little smoking jacket with the leather patches on the elbow.
Yeah, with a little pipe. He's walking through his college class looking for heuristics left and right.
Looking for heuristics, as Horton often does, yes.